bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone.
Grave diggers.
Hey everyone,
Hey folks,
it's Erin in Seoul,
and it's Amr in sunny Toronto.
and welcome to another episode of Das Criminal Podcast.
Yeah, we are continuing where we left off this time. You don't have to listen to our previous episodes, but they will give you a good clarification, because today we'll be discussing the often repeated word Benghazi.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to actually researching and doing this episode, but I'm not looking forward to the comments we're going to get.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we stay away from I assume conservatives aren't listening to our podcast by now, but it should be interesting to see what kind of comments we get.
On September 11th and September 12th, 2012, members of an Islamic militant group in Libya known as Ansar al-Sharia attacked the American diplomatic compound in Benghazi and a CIA annex approximately 1 mile away. The attack resulted in the deaths of U.S. Ambassador to Libya J. Christopher Stevens, U.S. Foreign Service Information Management Officer Sean Smith, and CIA contractors Tyrone S. and Glen Doherty. In the United States-centric lexicon, Benghazi has become synonymous with a series of investigations into then-Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. And Clinton and the Obama administration are responsible for the chaos in Libya, but not in the manner peddled by conservatives. As in the rise of Islamist militants in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia, the attack in Benghazi is an example of the United States reaping what it has sown by supporting reactionary rebels in a foreign country. What really happened in Benghazi, and how is it tied to U.S. imperialism in Libya? Hopefully, by the end of this episode, the answers to those questions will become more transparent for us. When we ended our last episode on Libya, Muammar Gaddafi's government was deposed and replaced by the NATO-backed National Transitional Council. Council-tied rebel forces ruthlessly killed Gaddafi himself. Though that episode isn't vital to understanding this one, we'd recommend giving it a listen for some helpful background information. As we noted then, Libya has been more challenging to research than some other Arab uprising states. This is partly due to the disagreements that almost immediately hatched over what to do or what not to do in Libya in 2011. Writers and philosophers like Jean-Luc Nancy, Gilbert Achcar, and Emmanuel Wallerstein appeared to favor intervention in the country. In contrast, others like Michael Walzer, Alain Badiou, Edward S. Herman, Maximilien C. Forte, and Laurent Louis have opposed foreign meddling.
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind that opposing foreign intervention doesn't mean supporting or liking Gaddafi or any given incumbent leader or government. And I'm trying to avoid the use of the word regime here because I think that word is loaded. Anti-intervention, at least for me, it stems from the supposition that meddling causes worse outcomes. This supposition is, for me, this episode proves that very, very well.
Despite such opposition, the United States and NATO did intervene in Libya, convincing the United Nations Security Council to enforce a no-fly zone over the country before leading their own bombing campaign in support of the anti-Gaddafi rebels. With this air force on their side, the rebels managed to overthrow the Libyan Arab Republic. But what type of government would form in its place and which policies it would seek to institute were still mostly unclear. Even mainstream media outlets published skeptical accounts of Libya's new government, the National Transitional Council, or NTC, and acknowledged its friendliness toward Western neoliberal interests. In a July 2011 article titled, "So Who Are Libya's Rebels Exactly?" for the Christian Science Monitor, Dan Murphy pens, quote, "The TNC itself is largely drawn from upper-middle-class professionals, lawyers, doctors, professors, and some wealthy businessmen, with a sprinkling of Gaddafi officials who have defected. Many of them come from prominent families that suffered when Gaddafi seized power, and harbor grievances about businesses and property taken from them in the years since. Among this core, there's still fury at Gaddafi's attempts to outlaw private industry earlier in his reign, and they profess a generally free market outlook. Libya's oil? They say it should be sold to the highest bidders."
Yeah, this is particularly interesting because it contrasts heavily with Syria, which we'll get into in a coming episode that's coming soon. But in Syria, the upper middle class either sat out the war and fled or supported the incumbent government of Assad. Moreover, I think that in situations of civil war and wartime chaos, the groups that are most ruthless are the ones that usually win power, and those tend to be extremist militants, whereas the sort of cadre of professional middle class tends to be drowned out due to their lack of popular support among lower class peasantry and the working class, and their lack of fighting experience.
In August of 2011, MSNBC published an interview with journalist Jeremy Scahill, who was quoted as saying, quote, "I think that the possibility of Libya continuing to be incredibly unstable for a long time to come is completely there. And who are these guys? Are they Islamists? Are they corrupt sheikhs? Who is it that we're backing now?" End quote. In September 2011, Amnesty International published a press release detailing Libyan rebel crimes against Libya's racial and ethnic minorities, specifically the Black Tawarka Libyans. The report states, quote, "In addition to Tawarkas, other Black Libyans, including from the central Sabha district, as well as sub-Saharan Africans, continue to be at particular risk of reprisals and arbitrary arrests on account of their skin color and widespread reports that al-Gaddafi forces used quote-unquote African mercenaries to repress supporters of the NTC." End quote. So, it's clear from these reports, all published over a year before the attack on the American diplomats in Benghazi, that those paying attention felt cynical toward the NTC and Libya's future. Additionally, the 2011 uprising in Libya saw the birth of several Islamist militant groups in the country. According to Faisal Arshad of the BBC, several of these, most notably the Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah Brigade, the Malik Brigade, and the 17th of February Brigade, would eventually band together to form a group called Ansar al-Sharia, in English, supporters or partisans of Islamic law. Put a pin in this because it will become imperative later.
In a fractal war like Libya, it's also important to distinguish between genuine political factions contending for power, which Ansar al-Sharia is an example in this point, and those that are basically nothing more than armed gangs controlling a city block or two. So the genuine political factions tend to form coalitions controlling, first of all, a larger number of soldiers, second of all, larger territory, and third of all, have discrete political aims as well as some economic leverage and financial leverage, whereas the latter, the gangs, are basically content with extorting and intimidating the local population on what they consider their turf.
Militia membership increased sharply during Libya's first civil war in 2011, and remains high even after Gaddafi's government fell to the rebels. Cameron Glenn of the Wilson Center comments, quote, "After Gaddafi's ouster, the transitional government, which preceded the General National Congress, co-opted militias to fill the security vacuum. This policy led the number of militia fighters to swell quickly from 120,000 to more than 200,000, accounting for nearly 11% of the country's workforce." End quote. Crucial to our story is the covert United States support of such militias. According to the New York Times, the Obama administration sent weapon shipments to Libya's rebels via Qatar, which eventually ended up in jihadists' hands. Now, I believe that this is because US-backed insurgents and Islamist militants in Libya are the same people. These weapons never changed hands. Rather, the Obama-Clinton administration purposefully supported the anti-Gaddafi rebels knowing full well their Islamist tendencies, and, lo and behold, this came back to bite them. The administration then tried to backtrack, claiming that these weapons later constituting an arsenal for jihadists were just an oopsie. This is just my interpretation based on more than a dozen sources gathered for this episode. You are welcome to disagree.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree. I think the myth of moderate rebels needs to die now. I cannot accept that an intelligence apparatus as expensive as the US doesn't already, A, know that its weapon will be delivered to the hands of Islamists, or B, using Qatar as a middleman means those weapons will be delivered to Islamists. Because Qatar is a country notoriously known for supporting Islamist factions. Also, the US has a long history of empowering Islamists as a counterweight to secular pan-Arabist, socialists, Nasserists, etc. I mean, during the Cold War, they were openly arming the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, back when an alliance with Islamists was allowed to be acknowledged in the open. It is clear that the US has no issue supporting Islamists as long as they basically stay what we consider quote-unquote over there.
Also central to our story is the CIA's activity in Benghazi following the 2011 uprising. The New York Times reports, quote, "Within months of the start of the Libyan revolution in February 2011, the CIA began building a meaningful but covert presence in Benghazi, a locus of the rebel efforts to oust the government of Colonel Gaddafi," end quote. From Wikipedia, quote, "Multiple anonymous sources reported that the diplomatic mission in Benghazi was used by the CIA as a cover to smuggle weapons from Libya to anti-Assad rebels in Syria," end quote. Again, this makes it very difficult for me to believe that the Obama-Clinton administration had no idea that the weapons and support provided to these rebels might also be used in support of Islamist militarism. Reports published after the Benghazi attack indicate United States confusion over which rebel groups remained loyal to their Western benefactors and which would turn their weapons against their former partners. But the existence and U.S. support of Islamist rebels in Libya is not disputed.
There's an apt analogy here about something about biting hands that feed, but it's quite ironic.
Leading up to the 2012 Benghazi attack, Islamist militias were responsible for violence and threats of violence against foreign targets in Libya, including the U.S. Consulate, the United Nations Special Envoy to Libya, the International Red Cross, the British Ambassador's Convoy, and the Tunisian Consulate. A United States Senate report later summarized, quote, "In the months leading up to the attack on the temporary mission facility in Benghazi, there was a large amount of evidence gathered by the U.S. intelligence community and from open sources that Benghazi was increasingly dangerous and unstable, and that a significant attack against American personnel there was becoming much more likely," end quote. There is also evidence that local security guards employed by the U.S. consulate were instrumental in the attack. Sean Smith, one of the deceased, messaged a friend on the day of the attack that he noticed a quote-unquote police officer photographing the embassy and expressed fear that an attack was imminent.
Who could have known that sticking an Islamist extremist in a police uniform doesn't exactly change the Islamist's belief?
So now we get into the actual events of the attack, and these are largely not disputed. On September 11th, 2012, Ambassador Stevens was at an American outpost in Benghazi with no more than 6 other Americans. Note that this was not the U.S. Embassy, which was in the capital, Tripoli. This was a diplomatic compound with limited security. Early on in the evening, there were no signs of unrest outside the compound. At around 9:40 p.m. local time, large numbers of armed men shouting "Allahu Akbar" approached the compound from multiple directions, throwing grenades over the wall and entering with automatic weapons fire, RPGs, and heavier weapons. According to witnesses and survivors, it was relatively easy for these men to breach the compound and get into the main building. Those inside the compound called the Embassy in Tripoli, the Diplomatic Security Command Center in Washington, the 17th of February Brigade, and a U.S. Quick Reaction Force located at the Annex compound about a mile away. Ambassador Stevens, along with Diplomatic Security Service Special Agent Scott Strickland and U.S. Foreign Service Information Management Officer Sean Smith, retreated to a safe room. Simultaneously, the other agents went to get their weapons, but were then unable to return to the main building, where the safe room was, as the attackers were already there. The attackers attempted to enter the safe room, but could not penetrate it, so they lit fire to the area.
Okay, so wait, aren't panic rooms or safe rooms supposed to be fireproof? At least that's what I imagined, no?
I think safe from actually maybe catching on fire or burning, but not from smoke, which was the problem here, smoke inhalation.
Okay, that makes sense, okay.
Because you can't just 100% seal off a room, or I suppose you wouldn't get any air in there.
Yeah, they'll die. They'll only have a limited air supply. That makes sense.
Strickland was able to flee the area through a window, but Stevens and Smith did not follow. The other agents returned with an armored vehicle and searched the area, but could only retrieve Smith's body. He had died due to smoke inhalation. The agents were unable to find Stevens because locals had managed to see him and take him to a nearby hospital, where he never regained consciousness. The survivors returned to the nearby CIA annex building. On the way, their armored vehicle was hit by AK-47 rifle fire and hand grenades. On September 12, 2012, just after midnight, the CIA annex comes under attack by machine gun, rocket, and mortar fire. CIA agents there, and some who had commandeered a small aircraft in Tripoli and came to Benghazi as reinforcements, tried to fend off the attackers. 2 of these agents, Glen Doherty and Tyrone S, were killed by mortar fire while on the building's roof.
In fact, one of the missions in Call of Duty Modern Warfare's campaign mode basically mimics the entire Benghazi battle. So you're a US Marine and you've captured the leader of the fictional Islamists in the game. The leader is called Omar the Wolf, and the fictional Islamist called al-Qatala, which I've mentioned before, literally just means the killers. And you're holding him in the local embassy of the fictional country of Urzikstan, the local embassy of the US in the fictional country of Urzikstan. When Islamists attack and you have to fend them off, I mean, it's not exactly subtle, up to the mortar attacks and rooftop last stands.
The surviving Americans then went to the Benghazi airport to evacuate. On the way, their vehicles were hit by small arms fire. According to the New York Times, the Libyan government didn't realize the extent of the United States CIA operations in Benghazi until dozens of agents showed up at the airport trying to flee.
Sorry, but you describing that, all I can imagine is like, you know those like clown cars where like a small car shows up and like 20 people come out?
Yeah.
Like I imagine a clown car showing to the airport and like one agent come out and they're like, huh, okay. And then another agent, and then another agent, and then another agent, and then some hapless Libyan government bureaucrat is like, oh dear, oh no.
Ambassador Stevens's body was later recovered at the Benghazi Medical Center, a hospital controlled by the Ansar al-Sharia militia. Doctors also ruled his cause of death as smoke inhalation due to the fire at the compound. Initial reports suggested that the attack on the diplomatic compound in Benghazi was spontaneous, resulting from protests against an anti-Islamic film titled Innocence of Muslims. Earlier that day, protesters in Cairo, Egypt had managed to scale the walls and enter the courtyard of the US Embassy. I listened to Ben Rhodes bleating on about this on one of those crooked media, pod save, blah, blah, blah podcasts, so you don't have to. And in summary, the Clintonites still don't have an explanation for the attack on the diplomatic compound other than, quote unquote, angry Muslims. This contradicts the State Department's investigations and frames the attack in some clash of civilizations rhetoric that ignores how United States intervention in Libya directly enabled this attack, which we're about to analyze.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy for libs to swallow this nonsense hook, line, and sinker because what I see is that they can't comprehend systemic causes of particular incidents. I mean, they're conditioned by movies and books as well as the educational system, where every bad thing has to have one specific inciting factor, not a complex web of causes, much in the same way that, for example, World War I history is taught in schools as being caused by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, not, rising nationalisms, colonialism, imperialism, etc., etc.
That kind of reductive thinking is exactly the opposite of what we need.
Yeah.
Ansar al-Sharia in Libya took responsibility for the attack, and investigations later corroborated this version of events. The attack was not spontaneous, though some individuals may have joined impulsively, of course. It was a coordinated terrorist attack. Now, remember when we discussed Ansar al-Sharia before and told you we'd get back to them? According to reporting from the BBC, Ansar al-Sharia was mainly composed of fighters from other militias, the Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah Brigade, the Malik Brigade, and the 17th of February Brigade. But who did the diplomats call for help when the compound was under attack? The nearby CIA annex, the embassy in Tripoli, the Diplomatic Security Command Center in Washington, and the 17th of February Brigade. Yes, you are hearing this right. The US diplomats called for backup from the very same people who were possibly involved in the attack. So this is a quote from Cameron Glenn's Wilson Center article. Quote, "The 17th of February Martyrs Brigade, one of the largest and best armed militias in eastern Libya, was formed by members of the Muslim Brotherhood during the 2011 uprising. The brigade, which previously received funding from Libya's defense ministry, has carried out law enforcement functions in southern and eastern Libya. Several hundred fighters reportedly left the group to join Ansar al-Sharia in 2012, but the two groups maintain close ties." End quote. What the fuck?
Yeah, that is just... There's a delicious sense of irony there, considering US support for Islamists. It's very, very tasty.
So this, to me, implicates the United States once again in arming Islamist militias that would later turn their guns on the US itself. It's precisely the Mujahideen in Afghanistan situation. The United States collaborated with Islamists to overthrow a government they didn't like, and then acted surprised when these militants continued to do militant stuff with their fancy weapons and training in a country otherwise suffering economic and political turmoil.
And it also, for me, it also highlights a very important and understated issue for me, which is the ongoing tension and conflict between the US State Department and the CIA. This also flares up in Syria, and we'll get to that. To me, it's either deliberate antagonism or a complete and total failure in intelligence gathering and communications by the CIA, that a faction that you're arming is working with a direct enemy and is not being flagged, or that information is not communicated to State Department frontline staff.
I mean, I can't believe in all of the conspiracy theories surrounding Benghazi, all of the hubbub, how this is not brought up more. That they called for help from the people who were actually attacking them.
Yeah, I mean, all I hear about Benghazi is emails this and emails that and Hillary and whatever. But like, yes, Hillary is, I'm not defending her or anything. Shouldn't there also be like accountability for the head of the CIA and like all of the failures of intelligence there?
There are more than a few indications here as well that these attackers had some connection to the diplomatic compound and CIA annex other than simply noticing there were Americans there. First, they attempted to seize Ambassador Stevens when he was inside the safe area before resorting to an arson attack. This indicates they had a specific target in mind, more than just an impromptu invasion by angry Muslims. Sean Smith had mentioned to a friend that he noticed police photographing the compound the day of the attack and expressed suspicions that they were being surveilled. As Amr alluded to earlier, a lot of these militia groups also served as the police in this area. When the compound was up in flames and 2 people had died, the attackers didn't give up and go home. They went over to the CIA annex and attacked that too. This indicates a planned, coordinated assault.
Yeah, I mean, reports of the attack says that the attack included mortars and RPGs. So it's not just like a mob with pitchforks and torches. That is a well-organized militia executing a prepared offensive operation, in my opinion.
The attack also occurred on September 11th, the anniversary of 9/11, and of course an important date in the American consciousness in terms of terrorism. Additionally, Ansar al-Sharia, the group responsible, not only had members with connections to US-backed rebel groups like the 17th of February Brigade, but controlled the Benghazi Medical Center at the time. This was more than a ragtag insurgent group, it had considerable power in that area. Benghazi, as we all unfortunately now know, became a flashpoint in American politics. Republican politicians blamed the Obama administration and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton for failing to defend the compound before and during the attack. Meanwhile, Democrats asserted that there were departmental failures in protecting the diplomatic mission, but that these errors didn't go all the way up to Clinton herself.
Yeah, I mean, let me preface this by saying that A, I don't support Islamists by any means, and B, I don't think that like the desk clerk or the security guard at the door in a given embassy or consulate should be held accountable for the country's crimes. But, big but, Hillary Rodham Clinton once jovially remarked, while laughing, referencing the Libya campaign and the murder of Gaddafi, the brutal murder of Gaddafi that we talked about in the last episode, quote, "We came, we saw, he died," end quote. Well, fuck you, Hillary.
It's just so smug about something so horrible.
Yeah, like, it's not like, I mean, it is a success in the sense that if you consider the aims of the US were to just destabilize the country and overthrow Gaddafi, then yeah, it was a success, sure. But like, just so annoying. Like you said, like, smug is the perfect word. Like, shut the fuck up.
It's why she is just so universally hated as well. It should be for her actions, but it's actually for her attitude.
Well, it's her actions and her attitude, and just like, that's the thing that bothers me the most. Is she not self-aware at how loathed and despised she is?
Clearly not, I mean.
Yeah.
So, as Amr noted last week, Benghazi is to Republicans as Ukraine is to Democrats. Was there some institutional failure and political shadiness around it? Yes. Is that the main issue at play here? In my opinion, no. Benghazi is the United States reaping what it has sown. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, the Obama administration is blamed for the deaths of 4 Americans in Libya, but not the catastrophic effects of their bombing campaign on the country as a whole. In addition to people who were literally killed by the NATO bombs, Libya has been destabilized, thousands of people have died in 2 civil wars or drowned in the Mediterranean, Islamist militias terrorize people, especially racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, and women's rights have backslid. Even mainstream media outlets note that the Obama administration immediately cozied up to Libya's private oil interests forming the new government. They also acknowledge that some segments of Libyan society had Islamist tendencies, though Gaddafi was mostly successful at holding these back, sometimes even with help from the West, especially post 9/11. Like, in my opinion, Obama, sorry, but if you want to run with the wolves, don't be surprised when they fucking eat you.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like these groups were particularly subtle about their ideology or their aims or their interests. I mean, like, half of them have some variation of Death to America on their flag or logo or whatever. So, like, come on, man.
Well, it's also the same thing in Afghanistan and Iraq and Somalia. How many times does this have to happen before you learn your lesson?
Yeah, I mean, it's either they don't learn, or, and I'm starting to believe this more and more as I get more and more cynical about things, these things are seen as an acceptable cost for achieving geopolitical aims. Like the 6 or so Americans that died at the embassy, or the consulate, sorry, are a trade-off for overthrowing Gaddafi and destabilizing Libya. It's seen as a cost-benefit analysis. And for the top brass, right, for Obama, for Clinton, for the proper, ruling class of America, like an ambassador and a couple of CIA agents dying is considered a decent cost for that, a decent price for that.
Yeah, and to put this into a different perspective, since some Americans really like to count deaths, like in terrorist attacks, like constantly saying this is how many 9/11s, over 1,000 people were shot and killed by police in the United States in 2020 alone. So that's a Benghazi more than every other day. And it's much more of a systemic issue than this one time that 4 people were killed. Like, I agree that it's horrible that those 4 people died, but it is not as horrible as the absolute chaos that has been wreaked on Libya.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the sort of tenets of American exceptionalism that only American deaths count. It's the same way like Iraq is classified as a failure, not because the Iraq invasion killed over 1 million Iraqis, but because it killed a couple of thousand Americans and made a bunch of vets depressed. And yes, the deaths are bad, but the orders of magnitude of deaths higher among Iraqi, men, women, children, and the birth defects in Fallujah and all that. It just doesn't factor into American calculation at all.
It's also worth noting how we said bystanders saw Ambassador Stevens and took him to the hospital. Literally, some young men saw this fire, pulled him out of a window, and took him to the hospital.
Yeah, I mean, we did mention that the hospital was controlled by the Ansar al-Sharia at this point, but I'm pretty sure the young men just wanted to get him to a hospital to get him treated. They weren't really considering, we'll take him to a place. Yeah.
Definitely, and you just take someone to the nearest hospital.
This was an emergency. They had to take it to the nearest hospital, not pick and choose what hospital to go to.
Yeah, but do you think if the Libyan embassy were on fire or the Libyan consulate were on fire in the United States that people would run in to rescue others? I have doubts.
Oh, very much doubtful.
So, in addition to all of this, Michael Bay did a terrible film based on a book about the 2012 Benghazi attack by this guy named Michael Zukov? Great name.
Yeah, I want to say Zakov. I think that's an appropriate pronunciation.
So, it's your run-of-the-mill Michael Bay action film set in the context of Benghazi, but also entirely decontextualized, so it's horrible, as you can imagine. Usually I'm a defender of so-called low culture, but I just cannot get behind it because it's your standard, USA hoorah action trash. I don't even mind, a simple action romp to occupy my attention for an afternoon, but 13 Hours is just a wannabe Clint Eastwood, but somehow worse film.
Yeah, it also stars John Krasinski, who's otherwise known as Jim from the US version of The Office, who also stars in Amazon Prime's TV series Jack Ryan. So what I understand is that his post-Office career seems to be being Hollywood's latest go-to guy for the sort of rough but ruggedly handsome US Marine / CIA agent / some form of state security apparatus guy trying to protect the American way of life in various dangerous settings that are ironically all enemies of the US geopolitical agenda.
Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, let me be clear, I still do not like Michael Bay. He said horrible things about Megan Fox. That's not okay. I don't think it's a good film. I do, however, think it is representative of the American attitude toward Benghazi, in the fact that it is just there and about Benghazi, but there is no context. Like, you could forget it's in Libya, but it's in Benghazi.
Oh, yeah. That's something that I find actually really interesting. If you line up all the people who complain about Benghazi, right? And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not defending Hillary Clinton here, but the people who accuse Hillary Clinton of doing Benghazi, whatever the hell that means, if you line them up and ask them what country is Benghazi located in, do even 50% of them know where? I doubt 50% would even tell you that it's in Libya.
Well, it's also just listening to these people during the 2016 election would say, Hillary's horrible for what happened in Libya. And you're like, yes. And then they'd say, letting our men die in Benghazi. And you're like, no.
The real horseshoe theory is leftists and conservatives hating Hillary Clinton, if you think about it.
Yeah, but hopefully we have shed some clarity on what actually happened and how it was the fault of the Obama-Clinton administration for giving these people weapons that they later turned on them.
Yeah, if this episode has one moral, it's that you're allowed to hate Obama and Hillary, but not for just, killing 5 US Marines or letting them die. It's for a whole variety of causes and reasons.
So next week, we are coming back with Libya's second civil war and the so-called migrant crisis. Please tune in to find out why I absolutely hate that phrase. And then we will be doing Yemen, and we will end our Arab Uprising series with Syria, and I am absolutely dreading it.
Please don't at us with your Syria theories. Please don't DM us. Please don't email us. We will do the episode and then you can talk to us, but it's going to be controversial. I feel that already.
I think it will be controversial in the same way this Libya one is, where we really do just criticize everyone.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will take our criticism as either implicit or explicit support for, quote unquote, the other side. But I think it's a lot more complicated than that, and, people need to be aware of that.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Pretty much, yeah.
So if you like our content, you can find us on Patreon at Das Criminal, patreon.com/Das Criminal. It's always in the description. You can also find us on Instagram at Das Criminal Pod. And please rate, review, subscribe, and tell your friends. This is definitely an episode that we want to drive up on those algorithms so that people see us before fucking Navy SEAL standing podcasts.
Yeah, Burning Quran Coffee Company podcast, whatever the hell it's called, yeah.
Yeah, so we will catch you later with some more content. It's been real.
Yeah, until next time, everyone. Bye.
Bye.